are talking about healthy forests in Ask Me Anything with Dr. Susan Cook-Patton tonight. I am Dana Nuccitelli. I am CCL Research Coordinator, calling in from Sacramento area. Our speaker is Susan Cook-Patton. She is a Senior Forest Restoration Scientist on the National Natural Climate Solutions Science Team at the Nature Conservancy. She works to quantify the climate mitigation potential of reforestation and other natural climate solutions and infuse the best available science into policy decisions, which we always like to have happen. To do this, she collaborates with scientists across the globe and from academic, government, and other non-governmental organizations. She has over a decade of experience leading scientific investigations into how changes in biodiversity and climate are impacting forest, grassland, and urban ecosystems. Before joining the Nature Conservancy in 2016, she was a policy fellow at the U.S. Forest Service and a research fellow at the Smithsonian Institution. Susan holds a PhD in community ecology from Cornell University and a bachelor's degrees in biology, psychology, and English from Indiana University. That's very diverse. Her publications cover topics ranging broadly from invasive species to prehistoric and Native American middens to climate change impacts on mangrove forests. Her work can be found in leading journals such as Nature, Nature Climate Change, Science Advances, and Global Change Biology. As an avid proponent of effective science communication, she has shared much of her research with the public via videos for grade school classrooms, public lectures, and major news outlets such as National Public Radio, the BBC, and The Guardian, which that's one of my favorites, The Guardian. So our agenda tonight, we're going to do a little introduction. That was her background. And then Susan Cook-Patton is going to do her little presentation. And then we're going to do the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation. It's an honor to speak with this group that's helping to fight the good fight to help tackle climate change. And I'm really looking forward to the questions that you're going to ask me. I've never done an Ask Me Anything before, so this will be fun. And I'll just have maybe three caveats. The first is 8 o'clock is not my prime hour. I'm a morning person, and I never quite know what's going to come out of my mouth. So now is a good time to say that although I work for the Nature Conservancy, what I tell you today will be my opinions. I make no attempt to try to speak on behalf of a very large global organization. The other caveat is that on the other side of this door here, I have a sick kid who is happily watching a movie at the moment, but it's possible there will be interruptions. So in the world of Zoom, we will just roll with whatever happens. And yes, so I guess I will go into my presentation now. So I work on reforestation as a natural climate solution. And I wanted to start with what motivates my work, which is that I am a mother. There's black there spells mom. I have two kids, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. And my eldest in particular is very into nature. And it's just sort of heartbreaking to think about some of the species and ecosystems that she loves so much are threatened. But we thought long and hard about having kids. And thought, okay, well, if we're going to bring new kids into this world, I will try to fight every day to create a better world for them and us and all our children of the future. And luckily, I have a job that lets me do that. So I feel very blessed and honored. Usually when I give presentations, I put this together a few weeks ago, so these headlines are a bit old now. But I give a lot of presentations, and I used to have to sort of dig for examples of how climate change is impacting us. But you guys know this as well as I do. The impacts are starting to be felt increasingly and faster and more furiously. When I put this together, it was about terrible storm seasons that are already happening. From my own sort of corner of the world, this is, in the grand scheme of climate impacts, this is not a negative thing, but cherry blossoms in February are really strange, right? We don't expect our trees to be blooming in the middle of winter. But as I said, I'm not going to dwell on the negative impacts. I work on solutions to climate change. Our team works on what we call natural climate solutions, which are all the different ways that you can work with nature to either protect ecosystems, restore ecosystems, or improve the management of forests, grasslands, agricultural lands, and wetlands. For these solutions, they come with a lot of potential co-benefits, such as the creation of sustainable industries, environmental benefits like clean air, clean water, carbon storage, habitat for biodiversity, as well as promoting the resilience and culture and livelihood of those of us that depend most intimately on the land. I specifically work on reforestation, which is the transition from less than 25% tree cover to greater than 25% tree cover in places that historically supported forest. So often reforestation, tree planting gets a bad rap for putting trees where they don't belong. We try very hard to only put trees where they historically belonged. And just to start with sort of the main messages, which maybe will become clearer by the time we get to the end, but they are that reforestation is a powerful climate solution, especially if deployed sooner rather than later. But reforestation is only one tool of many, and we need them all. So the most important one is reduction in fossil fuels, as well as protection of intact lands. There's lots of different ways to restore tree cover. You know, people often think about planting, but you can rely on natural regrowth when conditions are right. You could also set up an agroforestry or a plantation system. And there's lots of different places to restore trees. And that's what we work on as part of our work, trying to find places where we might best restore tree cover. And that strategic investments are going to be needed along the reforestation pipeline if we are to accelerate reforestation as the climate solution. So this was the second paper that came out of my team's work, which attempted to quantify all the different ways we could use nature to provide additional climate mitigation in the US specifically. It came out in 2018. I'm just showing you sort of the top portion of the main figure in that paper, but it should be publicly available online if you want it, or I'm happy to send you a copy. The overall big number was that nature could provide up to 1.2 billion tons of climate mitigation per year, which is the same as 21% of our emissions in 2016, or the equivalent of removing all cars and light duty trucks off of the road. We found that forest, of all the different pathways, offered the greatest mitigation potential, and reforestation, which I worked on, I guess might be up here, was the biggest bar. But one of the things that I work on is that although reforestation is a large potential opportunity, it can be expensive compared to other natural climate solutions. You know, often it's more cost effective to protect a standing forest than to try to regrow it. There's also barriers associated with land use change, right? Like there's a reason there aren't trees on the landscape usually. And so we have to figure out where are the places where we could actually put trees back. And there's high uncertainty around the estimate. So the error bar here was, or the uncertainty bar was so large, they had to sort of just put an arrow to say it goes off the page. So, you know, what determines the uncertainty around this estimate? Well, it's uncertainty around the carbon accumulation rates. So we do a lot of work to try to improve our understanding of how much carbon you can get. There's uncertainty around the area of opportunity, which is what I'll talk about today. But then, of course, there's uncertainty around how much is it going to cost and how feasible is it? You know, are there places where people do want to actually restore trees back to landscape? So for area, you know, I like to say this work is, where are we going to put all those trees? Reforestation is really promising, but we've got to put trees back across many portions of the US. So this is the tool that wraps up sort of all of our science to date around mapping reforestation in the US. It's called the Reforestation Hub. You can go to www.reforestationhub.org. Our latest estimate is that there are up to 148 million acres of opportunity in the US. If we were to reforest that entire area, we would need 76.2 billion trees. And those trees could capture 535 million tons of CO2 per year, which is the equivalent of removing 116 million cars from the road. But that's sort of the big number, right? And we want it to break that down into a menu of options so that people could know, like, okay, what kind of opportunities do I have here versus there? So this is our menu. We focused on places that were sort of lower hanging fruit opportunities for reforestation and or places that could provide really high benefits to people. So those opportunities first were places that were already in some sort of natural land cover. We thought, okay, it's already a natural land. People could be encouraged to put trees back there. And so those were places that were already grasslands or shrubs, but could support forest, as well as places that are already protected. So that's like US Forest Service land. The next was to try to find places that were lower value, but being used by humans. So these are challenging croplands. Those are places that have soil types that impose severe to very severe restrictions on growth. And then pasture lands, we have all forestable pasture lands, which is maybe not always the most politically viable option, but it's not saying we should get rid of all grazing lands in the US. It's only about 13% of US grazing lands that are suitable for forest. And then we further break those down into pasture lands with challenging soils. And then another potentially lower value landscape is areas that are experiencing a flood event once every 5 years. Sometimes those are really good productive agricultural lands because you get the sort of rich alluvial deposits. But if a farmer is losing their crop once every 5 years, and as flood events become more frequent with climate change, maybe those places become less and less viable for production. So we included those as potentially lower value landscapes. And then our last were places that, maybe high value for humans, but if we put trees back, they could provide a lot of co-benefits that we might like. So the frequently flooded landscapes, we have that in there as co-benefits, because if you have trees upstream, you can help prevent flooding downstream. Riparian buffers are places just within 30 meters of streams, and those can be helpful, for example, in an agricultural landscape to prevent nitrogen pollution from fertilizer from getting into water and leading to dead zones in the Gulf. We also included urban open spaces. So those are like parks, cemeteries, roadsides, places where you could put some trees and get the additional sort of cooling benefits of trees, and especially in urban landscapes. And then TNC has a climate resilient map where those are the places that have sort of a lot of little variation that would help species better adapt to the climate as it changes. So this was actually a lot of different maps that we stacked on top of each other, but I won't drag you through all the details. But the first filter was, is it suitable for a forest? So yes, it was suitable for greater than 25% tree cover. And then we removed locations from that are not appropriate for additional trees. They already have enough trees. It's ice, snow, it's really dense urban development, it's fast roads, it's wilderness where you can't do anything. It's good cropland. And that leads to this very large area that's sort of big, biophysically suitable for restoration of forest cover. But then we break it down into that menu that I talked about. So just to give you a sense of what some of these look like, this would be a reforestation opportunity in a national forest in Oregon, probably a post-burn landscape. This is an example of a pasture land. I think this one is in Florida. Looks like it's starting to grow back, maybe. We could incentivize more trees coming back in that one landscape. Here's an example of these sort of stream side buffers, your own backyard. Here's an urban open space. So here, that's the reforestation hub. It gives you sort of the map of the total opportunity, but then you can click on these different things, like if you're looking at total opportunity, eastern story, because eastern forests grow faster. But if you're interested in federal opportunities, you can sort of click here and get federal opportunities, and you can see that's much more of a western story, because that's where our federal lands primarily are. You can click on an individual state. I live in Maryland, and gives you the opportunity in your state. And you can also click on an individual county. So this is where I live in Montgomery County, and get the sort of menu of options. So for us, we really need to focus on urban open spaces primarily. And then I wanted to show that, you can get the breakdown of these numbers, but then we also have these resources. Here's the original publication that explains how we did it. And then you can actually get to the spatial data if you want it, as well as the code now for generating the map. And then we have great resources from partners and other organizations about how to plant a tree, what trees to plant. And if it knows, I was looking at Maryland, so there are Maryland specific resources that come up. So let's see, Tana, how much time do I have? Should I cover one more thing or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So as a follow-on study to this paper, we asked okay, we want to bring reforestation to scale in the US. Can we do it? And so this paper came out shortly after and looks at the challenges to what we call the reforestation pipeline. And it used that sort of area that we found and asked, okay, if we were to reforest 80% of those natural land opportunities and 50% of the agricultural lands, what would that mean? That would mean 64 million acres that we need to reforest, which would be 30 billion trees. It would cost somewhere between $24 and $53 billion to plant and could sequester 147 million tons of CO2 per year. And you ask, okay, are we ready to have to get that reforestation done at scale? And we sort of had two scenarios. We said, okay, could you plant that whole area by 2030? And decided no, that would mean that you would have to have a fourfold increase in planting rates from what we currently have. So we said, okay, let's try it for 2040, which would mean you needed to increase from 1.3 billion seedlings per year up to 30 billion per year. Sorry, 33 billion per year. And that involves collecting seeds that of appropriate species to plant, growing those seeds up in a nursery, planting them, and then taking care of them after planting. And I can answer any questions that you want, but the short story is no, we're not fully ready at each of these steps. We need to invest in strategic seed collection. We need to invest in nurseries so that they have the confidence to start growing seedlings now that they're not going to sell for 3 years. We need to make sure that we have people that know how to plant trees and are willing to do it. And we definitely need to invest in post-planting monitoring to make sure that these projects are successful. So to return to my main messages, which hopefully make a little more sense now, reforestation is a powerful climate solution, especially if it's deployed sooner rather than later. Trees don't sort of spring into massive carbon stores instantly. They need some time to grow. Reforestation is only one tool of many, and we're going to need them all. So often a lot of the debate around reforestation is like, it's the sole solution to everything. It's not that, but it's definitely part of the solution. And of course, the most important thing is reductions in fossil fuels, and protecting intact forest is more cost and biodiversity and time effective usually than reforestation. There's lots of different ways to restore tree cover. I talked primarily about planting, but I do think it's important to remember that forests can often come back at a fraction of the cost and fraction of the effort if we just let them. That's what I'm doing in my own backyard. But then there's also ways that you can combine trees with livelihoods, like an agroforestry system and plantations. There's lots of places to restore trees, so we like to create a map of the menu of options. I'm not trying to sit in Washington, D.C. and say, thou shalt put trees in these locations, but give people the information that they need to make their own decisions about where they'd like to increase tree cover. And that strategic investments are going to be needed along the reforestation pipeline if we are to accelerate reforestation as the climate solution. So with that, I guess I will stop sharing, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Cool. Thanks, Susan. That was a lot of really good information. And just as a reminder, if you guys have questions, you can use the Q&A button in your menu there and type them in there. I just got one from Ray, and you could also, I think, feel free, like Devin just did, to use the raise hand feature, and then you can ask it verbally if you would prefer. Before I get to your questions, I'm going to abuse my power as the moderator and ask a question of my own, because that was a lot of good information. And I've used the Reforestation Hub a lot because I think it's a really useful tool. But you mentioned that like reforestation is not one of the cheaper natural climate solutions. So like what are the factors that make it relatively expensive compared to some other natural solutions?
Right. So what we talk about is cost effectiveness. So it's actually not the cost straight, but actually like how much does it cost per ton of carbon? Um, and I do want to emphasize that reforestation is one of the most cost effective ways we have to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So there are more nascent technologies for directly removing thanks for removing carbon dioxide, but they're like, you know, 200 to $600 per ton of CO2, whereas for reforestation we think you could there's potential to reforest like 400 million hectares across the tropics for less than $50 per ton, so much cheaper than other carbon dioxide removal strategies. But we cover both, like removing carbon from the atmosphere and preventing CO2 from going back into the atmosphere. So some of the cheaper ones are like protection of mangroves, for example, or existing forests where you've got an immense amount of carbon stored in that forest. And if you can keep it from being cut down, then you protect that carbon from being released into the atmosphere. And so that's usually why those are more cost effective. Yes. And then things like improved management can often be cheaper too, because sometimes, you know, you are applying less fertilizer, which prevents nitrogen emissions, but also saves the farmer money from having to apply the fertilizer to the field.
Okay. So it seems like a lot of the more cost-effective solutions might be maintaining existing carbon stores, and then is like reforestation one of the most cost-effective carbon removal
Yes.
solutions? Okay,
Yes.
interesting.
That's great. Great paraphrase. Thanks.
Okay. So let's see. Ray Welch has a question. Based on your reforestation scenario, do you have a graph that shows the ramp up in carbon uptake over time? Trees that take a long time to grow, and if we're starting from seeds, the capacity for carbon uptake would seem slow, at least at first.
Yes, so we have one of those published already for Canada. We did an NCS Canada assessment, but so not the US landscape, but it's exactly what you would expect, where it does take a while and then you sort of hit this, you know, exponential curve point, which is usually about 15 years is a sort of rough ballpark number, where you start really pulling down carbon from the atmosphere, and then eventually, you know, 100 years it starts to slow down. So yes, that's one of the reasons why reforestation is the sooner we can get those trees going, the better. Uh, and we are also developing global maps that show that trend through time for every sort of relevant pixel of the globe, but that work is in progress.
Hmm, interesting. Devin, did you still have a question you wanted to ask, or should we keep going with the written question?
Typed it. I typed slow, but I had time.
Okay, thanks, Devin. Oh, there it is. Yeah. So Devin asked, might you have good links to share, maybe who to contact for opportunities and how-tos?
Well, I guess I would like more information about what I can share lots of information, but I want to make sure it would be targeted. As far as how to actually go about doing reforestation, is that what you're thinking? Or?
Yeah, mostly, yeah.
Yeah, so probably the best place to start is in that resources tab in the reforestation hub. It's sort of in the bottom right panel of the map, where it clicks a lot of information from our partners from like Arbor
Oh,
Day.
thanks for, yeah, that's what I meant, just sharing the URLs in the chat or something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just put the reforestationhub.org in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Thanks.
I should say American Forest helps fund the reforestation hub too, so I should definitely give them some credit.
Yeah, we partner with American Forest quite a bit, so we're very familiar with them. Okay, we got another question from Ray. Can you talk about tree species? Are some better than others? I guess for in terms of carbon sequestration. Does your modeling assume any particular species? And also, is it dynamic as growing zones migrate?
Oh, okay, lots of good questions there.
Yeah.
If I miss one. Yes. So when we're talking about reforestation, we usually say sort of right species, right place, right way. So right species are going to be those that are adapted to current and future climate, and are sort of the species that people want, and ideally native species. I will just say that it's my opinion. And the right places, like we can't put trees everywhere, and if you're in a fire prone landscape out west, you don't want to pack the landscape with trees. You want to plant them widely spaced so that you don't exacerbate fire risks in those locations. And the right way is also like proper planting technique, but also sort of with full engagement of the communities that are there, so that you're picking places and trees that people want in that landscape. The ones that we usually model are sort of, we have forest type maps, like the US Forest Service has, like this is a forest type across this whole area, and Landfire is another source that has more specific forest types. But that's what we model, is sort of like, okay, this is an elm ash ecosystem. We will use an elm ash carbon sequestration rate. The trees that grow faster are not always the ones that are the like densest, and so there's sort of a trade-off between fast growth and carbon storage over the long term. I tend to think more just personally about biodiversity value. I'm a plant insect ecologist by training, and I really love caterpillars. And there are some species that are just really excellent at supporting caterpillars. And maybe you don't care about caterpillars, but birds feed their young primarily on caterpillars. So it's like, if you can plant native trees, you can have native caterpillars, and then you can feed the bird populations that we all like to look at. And caterpillars you should love, because they're really crazy little critters. Did I get them all, Dana? Love the questions there.
I think we pretty much got them all, except, like, I guess as climate zones shift, do we have to worry about tree zones shifting too, I guess, or do you have to worry about modeling that shift?
Yes, so that's actually something I think we could do better in our actual scientific models. We tend to think out to like 2030, 2050, where things aren't shifting that dramatically, but trees are very long lived organisms. And so I think the more we can do to think about moving genotypes, either from the southern zone to the north, or thinking about, planting species that we expect to be able to tolerate whatever conditions are coming down the pike is a very good idea.
Cool, thanks. Okay, Marilyn asks, what existing incentives or policies do you see for reforestation? So what's our policy solution there?
Yes, well, there was a recent announcement that came out of the USDA to invest in the reforestation pipeline, which was exciting. There have been some discussions around helping landowners to enroll in the carbon market by sort of offsetting the cost of implementation, because it can be costly upfront to sort of prepare the site and plant the trees. So if you can offset that, maybe people would be more encouraged to enroll their lands. Those are the two that spring most closely to mind. But I think from a sort of state and federal level policy, you're thinking more about sort of that reforestation pipeline, and then sort of personal incentives to individuals, of course, to get them to make decisions about how to manage their land.
Yeah, so one thing that jumped out at me on the reforestation hub is that pasture land is like the biggest chunk of potential reforestation land. So do you have any thoughts on how to incentivize and convince pasture landowners to do some silvopasture, some combining trees with their pasture land?
Yes, so I'm very excited about silvopasture. I think it makes a lot of sense, because you can get trees into the land without having much reduction in grazing, sort of fodder quality. The trees themselves can also provide fodder, and with the changing climate, we've done some work in the tropics, but I'm sure it's true in the US as well. Having trees can really improve livestock health. And so the cows can perform better because they're not stuck out in the sun, and suffering from heat stress. And gosh, we saw that there was a heat wave in Kansas where there was like a whole field of cows that died because they got too hot. And I thought, oh my gosh, silvopasture could really help with that. And it, for people too, the cooling benefits, but cattle can also benefit from it.
Yeah, there's a running joke on the CCL staff now that I'm a little bit obsessed with silvopasture too,
Are
because
you?
there's so much potential
Let's
there.
talk.
It's such yeah, and it's
Yeah.
good it's got so many good co-benefits for the livestock too.
Yeah.
Okay, question from Mark Friedman. There are recent studies indicating natural regrowth is more effective than trees planted by people. Can you comment on that?
So I'll give a funny story, silly story first, but I received some seedlings from my local community that was trying to get people to plant trees in their yard. And I had a red oak seedling, and I went out with my daughter and I planted the red oak seedling. And it was a beautiful moment. And then I literally like looked up, and like 5 feet away, there was a red oak seedling that like the squirrels must have planted, or that it just sort of rolled in. It was great. And so I had the two of them in my backyard, like, which one is going to do better? Is it going to be the one that I planted or the one that the squirrels planted? We've also done a large planting experiment along the Chesapeake Bay when I was at the Smithsonian, and some of the trees that grow best are the ones that came up from rootstock or seeds. So I do always sort of revert to the point, like, don't forget, like, the trees have been growing themselves for a very long time. Like, we do not always need to plant the trees. But there are definitely times where we do need to plant trees, like the sites are really heavily degraded. They're far from seed sources. Planting can also help to accelerate and kickstart the system. So, planting has its place. I just think we need to think first, like, oh, can we use natural regrowth? Yes, let's do it. No, okay, let's try planting and not just jump straight to planting.
Sounds good. Okay, Richard Barron asks how much new employment would be produced by a serious national forestry program and for how long?
Oh, that is an excellent question. Certainly for reforestation, you would need to employ people to collect the seeds. You would need to employ people to take care of the seedlings, and then outplanting as well. And so that would definitely create jobs. As far as the exact number, I feel like I have seen that from partners, but it's not, we haven't specifically worked on number of jobs. That is a great stat to have at your fingertips. I should work on getting that.
And I guess the jobs would last for as long as we kept on doing reforestation programs, right? So it could be a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Question from Anchor Shah. Have there been pilot projects done in the US yet using data from Reforestation Hub? I'm curious to know more about the long-term survivability of the planted trees and whether fire risk is considered for potential projects.
So there's a lot there. The Reforestation Hub itself, I think, has been used to date. I mean, so the paper came out in 2020, is that right? It's being used more to sort of think about strategies rather than inform actual projects, but planting has happened for a long time. And the Nature Conservancy has done a lot of that work to try to figure out, what are the best species to plant, what are the best densities, the question about shifting ranges. There's some work in Minnesota trying to think about what are the trees of the future. Can we develop those? TNC has done a lot of work with longleaf restoration, and they're definitely thinking about density to try to facilitate fire return to those landscapes. So I don't know, did I cover that question?
I think so. And then, yeah, the fire risk is like, we don't talk about how considerations about fire risks.
Right. Yeah. So fire has been part of forest out west for a long time. The problem we're in now is that we suppressed fire for a long time. And so the forests have gotten overgrown. So you certainly wouldn't want to pack more trees into landscapes. That said, there are an increasing number of fires that are burning out west, and there's likely going to need to be planting to restore forests to those landscapes, especially after severe fire. to help stabilize the soil and, protect the biodiversity and water resources in those locations. And yes, people are definitely thinking about planting them. I should know this, but like it's orders of magnitude smaller number of trees per acre that you would plant out west than what you would plant in the east. And people like the argument is like, do you plant them in clumps or do you sort of space them evenly out? But those are, I defer to my Western colleagues for the best ways to plant in the West.
And is the lower density of tree planting in the West because of lack of water because of drought, or is it to reduce the spread of fires, or is it both?
Probably both, but I was talking about in the context of reducing spread, so you can have a low severity, low burn come through rather than sort of hopping up into the crown and spreading and getting out of control.
That makes sense. Okay, question from Reed Hamilton. What portion of reforestation post-plant costs are related to thinning? For existing forests, thinning is a big topic.
Yes, I don't know. That's a good question. Our economic analyses are typically focused on the implementation. I don't think we've actually covered post-stand management. That tends to fall into the sort of improved forest management category. That is just slightly out of my domain.
Fair enough. Okay, another question from Anchor Shaw. I noticed you use the NLCD classes, which maybe you can tell us what those are. But for a global expansion of Reforestation Hub, could one use the ESA 10-meter classes from World Cover, or even fractional land cover class data from Copernicus Global Cover Data? And maybe you can tell us what all of that means.
So NLCD is the National Land Cover data set that says like, okay, it's 30-meter resolution. Say this is cropland, this is pasture land, these are sort of urban, different densities. We are creating a global reforestation opportunity map. I'll say that we're doing that with sort of great humility and trepidation, because it's sort of like a global map of saying where trees can go is a bit of an audacious effort. But we're doing it just to sort of add context. So we know like these are the countries where there's more or less opportunity. And because what's out there is pretty old at this point. I don't think 10-meter, just from like a processing standpoint, I don't think we can get to 10-meter resolution. We're shooting for a 1-kilometer resolution map. And also just, again, we're not trying to find exact sort of pixels where trees should go, but rather like places where there's more or less opportunity.
That makes sense. Okay, question from Cheryl Arney. How do we persuade owners of potential reforestation tracts to actually plant trees? Is there anybody taking on the job of implementing reforestation on potential tracts?
My gosh, I mean, I would be interested in your thoughts about what would motivate you all to reforest or not. I personally have gotten rid of all of the grass in my yard. It's not a very big yard, but I'm letting all of the trees grow back. I'm always delighted to see that there's like a lot of spaces around where I live that are just sort of like mowed for no reason. And those are the places that increasingly I'm seeing trees go. Those are not big tracts, but I think they all add up, right? The really big tracts are probably going to be more in a rural location. And so, potential motivations would be people who would want to tackle climate change, or potentially they want to set up a timber plantation for themselves or their future generations. The carbon market may be a way to incentivize that transition. There's probably lots of reasons why people would want to or not want to reforest, and it is a tricky question of how to convince people. But I spend a lot of my time talking trees to do exactly just that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us probably live in urban areas, and there's often like city projects to increase forestation in cities. Can you maybe talk about the potential size of urban reforestation as a solution?
Yeah, so urban reforestation, there's less area. If you're planting individual trees, you can only get so many trees in, a sidewalk. But there are sort of parks too, or schoolyards where you could potentially get more trees. Typically, the carbon storage from urban reforestation is smaller just because there's fewer trees and they're not growing as big. But the climate mitigation benefit can come from the how it helps us with cooling and heating. So it can help us, definitely help us in the summer to reduce the urban heat island effect. And in the winter, sometimes it can help reduce energy use as well. So you can get the benefit there. And then from like an adaptation standpoint, it's really big where I definitely notice it. Like I get off the metro and I'm walking through the urban core and it's super hot. And then you hit the neighborhood where the trees are, and it's just like a noticeable drop in temperature. So trees can be really valuable from a mitigation as well as adaptation standpoint.
Yeah, lots of great co-benefits from urban trees. Okay, question from Nancy Henley, who is a volunteer with the Old Growth Forest Network, and they're trying to protect one old growth forest in every county of the US where possible. National forests are not protected from logging. How do we get commercial logging out of public land? Nancy asks.
Oh, gosh. I don't know if I know the answer to that one. I will say for reforestation, it would be helpful to have some of that reforestation opportunity be new plantations, because then you could relieve pressures off of existing forest and harvest the plantations instead. That's of course like, I don't control the world. So it's sort of like getting the plantations in place and time to sort of shift to those rather than forest is a tricky question. But yeah, that's a tough question.
I often mention that if I could control the world, then these solutions would be so much easier.
I don't know if I would want to control the world, but it's good. It's controlled by many.
Okay, from Matt Mayers, we usually think of grassroots volunteer involvement with reforestation in the area of planting out and maybe post-planting care. Are you aware of other opportunities for non-professionals in the earlier stages of the pipeline?
Ooh. I mean, those are the ones that spring to mind most readily. I mean, I feel like never undervalue your ability to influence your friends and neighbors and children and colleagues, and just getting people excited about getting trees in their lands. So there's that sort of getting people excited from the first. But yes, those are the main ones that do come to mind. I feel like it would be hard for individuals to help with nurseries, and seed collection tends to be a pretty specialized field too.
Yeah, along the lines though, those lines though, like I've heard that like we have some old nursery facilities that just have been shut down and they just need funding to reopen. Like, what does it take to boost our number of nurseries growing seedlings?
Yeah, so we had that in that challenges to the reforestation pipeline, where we said, okay, like we talked to all of the federal nurseries and then a significant portion of private nursery owners, and said like, okay, how much additional bench space do you have? And that would boost our capacity, but it's not enough. You'd also have to expand capacity as well. So the challenge is that it's hard for nurseries to invest in expanding their facilities and rearing and taking care of the seedlings to sell them in 3 years. And so there has to be sort of upfront payments to offset the sort of risk of longer term ability to sell the seedlings.
Thanks. It looks like it may have been Iona who was the volunteer with the Old Growth Forest Network, and if so, I apologize for the misattribution. Another question from Ray. Has thinking evolved enough to have modeled a plan to actually deploy this massive planting effort? Like, who would do it, under whose direction and guidance, and how would it be paid for? Seems like inventing a company or a government workforce, or is this more aspirational and not really organized?
So what we documented was sort of the scale of the need and that we're not there yet. And so where that organization comes from, I think it's actually would be beneficial to be a private public partnership. I think we could probably get more reforestation done. But no, there's no sort of master plan. There's many people that are trying to get it to scale at sort of federal, state, and local community level. So that's always very encouraging.
Cool. Another one from Matt Mayers. Do you have an opinion on the American chestnut hybrids that are being introduced?
Do I have an opinion? uh, do I have an opinion? Well, I mean, gosh, I wish I could have seen American chestnuts in their heyday. They sound like such amazing trees. I personally, again, this is me speaking as myself and not my, I have no idea what the Nature Conservancy's opinion is, but I'm personally fine with genetically modified organisms, with caution, of course. But, if it allows us to bring a iconic tree back, I would be pretty excited about that.
Makes sense. Okay, another one from Mark Friedman. Do you believe that the U.S. Forest Service is on a path toward working on reforestation or still focused on lumbering?
Yes, so I will also not attempt to speak on behalf of the U.S. Forest Service. I did work for the U.S. Forest Service before I started at the Nature Conservancy, and reforestation was a really dominant strategy. They recognized that there were many more areas in need of reforestation than they had funding for, and so that was a big push to try to improve budgets towards reforestation. And I think those budgets have grown in recent years, but I'm sure we could use more to get reforestation across all of the national forest lands that need reforestation.
Okay. I think this one's from Alan Vest. Are the U.S. government departments involved with international forests effective in protecting and restoring them? Seems to me the U.S. is not up to par in this regard.
So I'm on a global team, and we do a lot of work trying to increase reforestation across many countries. I don't actually know specifically about U.S. involvement in international reforestation. Most of the partners we work with are either multinational organizations or the governments of those countries themselves.
Okay. From Marilyn and Greg, the potential for atmospheric carbon reduction from preservation and reforestation appears very high. What's the outlook for its realization with the existing incentives and policies?
Uh, we need more supportive policies and more funding. So when the first natural climate solutions paper came out, I think the sort of tagline was that nature could be 30% of the solution, but was only getting about 1% of the funding. I think we're up to maybe like 9%, 11% of climate finance. So there could certainly be more investment in nature-based solutions for climate change.
So on that topic, the Inflation Reduction Act had the like $20 billion for climate smart agriculture. And we actually submitted a comment to USDA suggesting that they should try to prioritize like agroforestry and silvopasture in those kinds of projects. Do you have any thoughts on like how much of that funding might actually go to forestry solutions?
Well, so I agree with you that we should definitely consider agroforestry more. We have another paper that's in review now that looks at sort of the potential additional carbon storage that could be in agricultural landscapes and like where you are. And you have places like Africa that already have a lot of trees in their agricultural landscapes. And the US was like the one that had sort of the biggest unrealized potential. But I think what that means is actually the development of systems that work with mechanized agriculture, right? Like we're not going to get farmers to stop using their large combines, of course. So can we figure out ways to like plant trees at wide spaces and, what are the impacts on growth? And a lot of the agroforestry research is focused on these sort of smallholder improving the sustainability of those systems. And I think we need a lot more research to figure out what's going to work in the US context. As far as the specific, like how much funding will go to agroforestry, I do not control the dollars, so I have no idea.
Right. So you're referring to like row cropping where you do like a row of trees and then a row of crops and then a row of trees, something like that. So you can still
Yeah, my guess, silvopasture and sort of that intercropping with like, trees, corn, trees is probably going to make the most sense. And
Outcropping. Yeah.
also riparian buffers, I think, is another place where we could get a lot of trees and benefits. Windbreaks. Thank you, Debbie.
Okay, so a question from Debbie. What can we as CCL do, and what do we do as a collective and national group in the forest area?
Well, I don't want to tell you what to do.
We're open to suggestions.
I mean, I think I would ask that you sort of take the information that I've shared today, if you think it would make sense for you, your community, your state. And if so, then you can use some of the resources that we put together to help advance supportive policies at sort of state, local, federal level for reforestation.
Cool. And as for what we are doing, I mentioned we sent the comment to the USDA to try to encourage them to spend some of that money on agroforestry and silvopasture, and we're doing educational events like this one with Susan. And we're gonna hopefully have some lobbying efforts on the Farm Bill once we get some information about the Farm Bill later this year. So we're working on it.
Right.
Okay, another one from Ray. Are you familiar with the Hayakawa method of urban reforestation? It's apparently a holistic method whereby a seed set that includes undergrowth is broadcast planned. I saw it in State Assembly bill in California, AB 57.
I have not heard of that. I will definitely look it up. Sounds interesting.
I think I just recently learned about this, where it's like I think it's in urban settings, you plant a very, very dense tree and shrub area, and then apparently it grows very well, I guess, if I'm remembering the right thing. It sounds interesting, but it's like pretty new here, but more established in other countries, I think. Okay, we got time for one more question from Matt Mayers. I recently saw some research indicating that some animal species have the potential to significantly boost the carbon sequestration capacity of forests and grasslands, etc. Do you foresee large-scale feature coordination between reforestation projects and wildlife reintroduction efforts?
Oh, that's a fun question. So I've seen some of that work recently too. And I think it is a really exciting idea to think about how biodiversity and carbon sort of play and boost and support each other. As far as large scale introductions, I think, again, it's, I was thinking about it more in the context of like, let's try to reforest places where you can help, where there's already existing biodiversity that could help that forest to recover. And so sort of taking advantage of the natural distribution of biodiversity to our reforestation carbon benefit. But I think, there are other places that are doing animal introductions as a way to try to get the systems back. I don't know, that makes me, I said I was fine with genetic diversity, but moving animals to places where they didn't belong before does make me nervous, because we've moved animals around the world to our detriment in many places.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't work out too well.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I want to be conscious of your time, especially with your ailing child and your other babysitting child. So thank you very much for your time tonight and making it work with your difficult situation. We really appreciate it. And that was really, really interesting and informative. And we'll have the recording of this up on the CCL YouTube page very soon. So just some closing slides. Please join us on the Nerd Corner on CCL Community if you want to have more nerdy forest and other discussions like this. Feel free to unmute yourselves and thank Susan for her time tonight and her great information. And thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Susan.
That was terrific.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @Citizens Climate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration.
Like what you hear? Recommend us to your friends and make sure to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us show up on other listeners' feeds. Feel free to pass on any suggestions for future episodes in the comments as well.
And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.